My name is Vivian, and I was 34 years old the evening my mother handed my 8-year-old daughter an empty cardboard box for Christmas. We were standing in the cavernous, marble-floored living room of my parents' sprawling suburban estate. The Christmas tree was 12 feet tall, professionally decorated in a rigid, monochromatic scheme of silver and frost, completely devoid of any homemade ornaments or childhood nostalgia. The floor beneath it was buried under a mountain of gifts wrapped in imported metallic paper. My daughter Maya had spent the entire evening sitting quietly on the edge of the velvet sofa, watching her Aunt Victoria unwrap a pair of diamond tennis bracelets, a designer handbag, and the keys to a brand-new imported sports car. When my mother finally handed Maya a large, beautifully wrapped box tied with a thick silver ribbon, Maya's eyes lit up. She was a polite, quiet child who never asked for much, and she tore into the wrapping paper with the pure, unadulterated excitement of an 8-year-old who believed she had finally been remembered. She opened the cardboard flaps, she reached inside, and she pulled out a fistful of biodegradable packing peanuts. She dug deeper, her small hands frantically searching the bottom of the box, assuming the actual gift was buried underneath. There was nothing, just air and foam. Maya looked up at her grandmother, her lower lip trembling, absolute confusion swimming in her eyes. My mother, Eleanor, took a slow sip of her champagne. She looked down at my devastated daughter and laughed. It wasn't a warm, teasing laugh. It was a cold, sharp sound. "Don't look so disappointed, Maya," my mother said loudly, ensuring the entire room of extended family and wealthy family friends heard her. "Kids like you shouldn't expect luxury. It builds character to realize you don't just get things handed to you in this life." My sister Victoria leaned against the marble fireplace, admiring her new diamond bracelets. She smirked, her eyes meeting mine over Maya's head. "Exactly," Victoria chimed in. "She needs to learn early, just like her mother. Worthless." I didn't scream. I didn't throw my glass of sparkling water against the wall. I didn't launch into a tearful, screaming defense of my child. I simply knelt down, helped Maya close the empty cardboard flaps, and took her by the hand. Because what my family didn't understand, what they had spent 34 years completely failing to realize about me, was that I do not fight with my voice. I fight with my ledgers. And my mother's cruel, arrogant laugh was the exact moment I officially decided to stop protecting them from their own. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, the channel where we tell the quiet, true-to-life stories of women who stop absorbing the abuse of narcissistic families and start reading the fine print instead. If you love stories where the loudest, most arrogant people in the room are silenced by a single sheet of paper, you are in the exact right place. Drop a comment below. Let me know you're listening, and be sure to subscribe so the next story finds you. To understand the sheer breathtaking audacity of that empty box, you have to understand the financial illusion that was the Sterling family. My father, Richard Sterling, was the CEO and founder of Sterling and Cross Luxury Imports, a company that supposedly sourced high-end, bespoke European furniture and imported it for ultra-wealthy clients and boutique hotels. My mother, Eleanor, served as the Chief Creative Officer, a title that mostly involved her having 3-hour lunches and expensing her designer wardrobe to the corporate account. My younger sister, Victoria, was 29 and held the title of Vice President of Marketing. Victoria had never run a marketing campaign in her life, but she drove a company-leased Porsche and lived in a luxury downtown penthouse subsidized entirely by my father's business. They were loud, flashy, and obsessed with the perception of extreme wealth. They measured human value entirely by the brand name stamped on the inside of a collar or the emblem on the hood of a car. And then there was me. I was the family's ultimate disappointment. When I was in college, I refused to join the family business. I didn't want to spend my life catering to the whims of my father's ego or dealing with my mother's constant, passive-aggressive critiques of my appearance. Instead, I graduated with a master's degree in accounting and went to work for a global risk management firm. I am a senior forensic accountant. My job is to track illicit funds, audit labyrinthine corporate structures, untangle shell companies, and uncover corporate embezzlement. I am a professional lie detector for corporate finance. To my family, however, My career was a joke. I was the boring corporate drone. Because I didn't drive a flashy car or wear clothes covered in designer logos, they assumed I was broke. They viewed my modest 3-bedroom house in a quiet suburban neighborhood as a profound personal failure. When my marriage ended amicably in my late 20s and I became a single mother to Maya, their disdain only multiplied. They treated my daughter and me as the embarrassing, impoverished relatives who were only invited to family functions out of a sense of grim obligation. Vivian just doesn't have the entrepreneurial spirit, my father used to tell his wealthy friends at dinner parties, completely unbothered that I was sitting right across the table. She likes the safety of a cubicle. Some people are just born to be employees, you know? They lack the vision to build an empire. I always let him talk. I never corrected him. I never mentioned that my salary was in the top 5% of earners in the state, or that I had a 7-figure investment portfolio compounding quietly in the dark. I didn't want their approval, and more importantly, I didn't want their financial manipulation. I knew that the moment they realized I had actual liquid capital, they would suddenly find a way to demand I invest it in sterling and cross. I kept my head down. I showed up to Thanksgiving and Christmas, absorbed their snide comments, and left early. I told myself I was taking the high road. I told myself that maintaining a superficial relationship with them was better than denying Maya the chance to know her grandparents and her aunt. But narcissists don't respect the high road. They view your silence as permission to escalate. The escalation began in the months leading up to that Christmas. The family business, Sterling and Cross, had supposedly just secured a massive new round of private investment to expand their operations into luxury hotel staging. My parents were insufferable. They upgraded their cars. My father bought a vacation home in a highly exclusive ski resort town. Victoria's Instagram feed was an endless, nauseating parade of first-class flights, designer shopping sprees, and champagne toasts at 5-star resorts. But as a forensic accountant, I have a very specific, highly trained instinct for when math doesn't make sense. And the math of Sterling and Cross was starting to give me a migraine. My father's business imported bespoke furniture. It is a high-margin business, yes, but it is also a highly volatile, capital-intensive industry with massive shipping costs, warehousing fees, and customs duties. To fund the lifestyle my parents and sister were suddenly living, the company would have to be moving tens of millions of dollars of inventory every single quarter with zero overhead. I knew the current state of the global supply chain. I knew the luxury real estate market was cooling. The economic environment did not support the kind of explosive, unmitigated growth my father was projecting to his country club friends. Furthermore, I noticed tiny, subtle behavioral shifts. My father, who usually couldn't stop bragging about his inventory, suddenly became very vague when people asked about specific hotel contract. His phone was always glued to his hand, and he looked exhausted beneath his expensive spray tan. Victoria, who usually flaunted her corporate title, had completely stopped posting about the office and was spending almost all of her time working remotely from exotic locations. The facade was too bright. It was the blinding, desperate glare of a warning light right before an engine completely detonates. About a month before Christmas, my father called me. It was incredibly rare for him to call me during the workday, unless he wanted to complain about someone. "Vivian," he said, his voice carrying a strained, artificial casualness. "Listen, your mother and I are updating some of our long-term estate planning documents. We're structuring some new trusts to handle the expansion capital. My lawyers need me to list all my immediate next of kin for compliance purposes. I need your social security number. And Maya's." I froze. The phone pressed to my ear. In my line of work, a sudden request for a social security number from a family member who is actively hiding financial stress is the equivalent of a blazing red siren. "You don't need my social security number to list me as a beneficiary on a standard estate trust, Dad," I said smoothly, my voice revealing none of the suspicions suddenly racing through my brain. "You just need my legal name and date of birth." "Well, the lawyers are being overly thorough," he snapped, his artificial casualness instantly evaporating into defensive irritation. "It's a complex corporate restructuring, Vivian. You're just a desk accountant. You wouldn't understand the high-level equity requirements. Just give me the numbers so I can get this paperwork off my desk. I'm not comfortable giving out Maya's social over the phone, Dad, I replied, my tone flat and uncompromising. Have your corporate attorney email me the exact trust documents they are drafting, and I will securely provide the necessary identification directly to their firm. There was a long, heavy silence on the line. I could hear his breathing. You know what? Forget it, my father spat venomously. I was trying to do you a favor. I was trying to ensure you and your kid had a safety net, since you clearly aren't capable of building one yourself. But if you're going to be this difficult and paranoid, I'll just leave you out of the restructuring entirely. Victoria is the only one who actually contributes to this family anyway. He hung up on me. I sat at my desk for a long time staring at the blank screen of my phone. He wasn't trying to do me a favor. Richard Sterling didn't do favors. He was looking for clean, unblemished identities to use for something. And because I had refused to hand mine over, I knew exactly who he had likely used instead. Victoria. I didn't investigate it then. I told myself it wasn't my business. If they were playing fast and loose with corporate equity, it was their liability. I drew a strict, ironclad boundary around my own life and focused on my daughter. And then came Christmas Eve. My parents hosted their annual Christmas party exactly as they always did, as a weaponized display of wealth. The driveway was packed with luxury vehicles. The caterers walked around with trays of champagne and miniature beef Wellingtons. Maya and I arrived in our modest sedan, dressed in nice, neat holiday clothes that didn't feature a single visible designer label. From the moment we walked in, we were treated like the hired help. My mother made a point of loudly introducing Victoria to her wealthy friends as the future CEO of the Sterling Empire, while vaguely gesturing toward me and saying, "And this is Vivian. She works in an office downtown." I watched Maya throughout the evening. She was so incredibly well behaved. She didn't ask for anything. She sat on the velvet sofa, sipping her sparkling cider, watching the grand spectacle of her family with wide, observant eyes. I had spent weeks preparing her, reminding her that Grandma and Grandpa were different, and that Christmas wasn't about the gifts they gave, but about spending time together. But nothing could prepare an 8-year-old for the targeted, malicious cruelty of an empty box. When the gift exchange finally began, it was less of a family tradition and more of an aggressive corporate bonus distribution. My father handed Victoria the keys to the new Porsche. My mother opened a velvet box containing a diamond necklace that cost more than most people's mortgages. They toasted each other. They took photos. And then my mother handed Maya the large, gold-wrapped box. When Maya opened it and found the packing peanuts, the room went completely still. It wasn't a prank. There was no envelope taped to the bottom with a gift card. There was no secondary box waiting in the wings. It was a deliberate, calculated humiliation. My mother had taken the time to wrap an empty box, tie a bow around it, and hand it to a child, simply to teach that child that she was inferior. "Kids like you shouldn't expect luxury," my mother had laughed, just like her mother. "Worthless," Victoria had smirked. I looked at my father. Richard Sterling was standing by the fireplace, a glass of expensive scotch in his hand. He wasn't laughing, but he wasn't intervening either. He just watched us, with a look of supreme, detached indifference. We were not his family. We were the audience he required to make himself feel powerful. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't give them the satisfaction of a dramatic, tearful meltdown that they could later gossip about with their friends. I knelt down in front of Maya. I gently brushed a stray piece of packing foam off her velvet dress. I looked her directly in the eyes and smiled, projecting absolute, unshakable calm. "You know what, Maya?" I said, my voice carrying clearly in the quiet room. "I think Grandma is right. We shouldn't expect luxury from people who can't actually afford it." My mother's laugh stopped instantly. Her eyes narrowed into furious slits. "What did you just say to me?" I stood up. I didn't look at my mother. I looked at my father. I saw the sudden microscopic twitch in his jaw. I saw the way his hand tightened around his scotch glass. "We're leaving," I said. I took Maya's hand and walked towards the grand entryway. "You walk out that door, Vivian, and you are done," my father bellowed, his voice booming across the marble floors, trying to reassert his dominance in front of his wealthy friends. You come back here and apologize to your mother. We opened our home to you. We tried to include you in this family's success. I didn't stop walking. I didn't turn around. I helped Maya into her coat, picked up my purse, and walked out the heavy oak front doors into the freezing December night. I drove Maya home in silence. I tucked her into bed, read her a story, and sat with her until she fell asleep. I smoothed her hair, looking at her sweet, peaceful face, and I felt a cold, terrifying clarity wash over my entire nervous system. They had crossed the line. They hadn't just insulted my career or my clothes. They had intentionally broken my child's heart to stroke their own miserable egos. They had used Maya as a prop in their pathetic theater of superiority. I walked out of Maya's room, went down the hall to my home office, and locked the door. I sat down at my workstation, cracked my knuckles, and opened my encrypted laptop. I am a senior forensic accountant. I know how to find the money. I know how to read the ledgers. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that the Sterling and Cross Empire was a house of cards waiting for a strong gust of wind. If my father thought I was just a desk accountant who lacked vision, he was about to learn exactly how much vision it takes to dismantle a company from the inside out. The first step in any forensic audit is identifying the flow of capital. I couldn't simply log into my father's corporate bank accounts. I didn't have his passwords, and attempting to hack them would be illegal. But I didn't need his passwords. I had something much better. I had public records, vendor databases, and the power of the Uniform Commercial Code. Sterling and Cross was a registered corporate entity in our state. I pulled their corporate filings from the Secretary of State's website. I pulled the Uniform Commercial Code, UCC, filings, which publicly list any secured debts or loans a company has taken out against its asset. What I found in the first 30 minutes made my blood run cold. Sterling and Cross didn't have a new round of private equity investment. They had a mountain of mezzanine debt. My father had taken out massive, high-interest loans from unregulated predatory commercial lenders, using his existing furniture inventory as collateral. But that wasn't the fraud. That was just bad business. The fraud was hidden in the vendor filings. I spent the next 3 days, the entire holiday week between Christmas and New Year's, locked in my office, drinking black coffee and meticulously tracing the supply chain. I utilized international shipping manifests, which are public records if you know the bill of lading numbers. I cross-referenced the bespoke Italian and French furniture manufacturers my father proudly boasted about on his company's website. Sterling and Cross hadn't imported a single container from Europe in 18 months. Instead, they were importing cheap, mass-produced furniture from unregulated overseas factories, shipping them to a warehouse in a neighboring state, and relabeling them as bespoke European luxury. My father was charging his elite clients and boutique hotels hundreds of thousands of dollars for items that cost him pennies on the dollar. He was committing massive, systemic consumer fraud. But even with those insane profit margins, the math still didn't add up. Where was all the money going? Why did he need the predatory loans? I dug deeper. I began pulling the property records from my father's new ski chalet, the corporate lease agreement for Victoria's penthouse, and the title for the new Porsche she had just opened on Christmas Eve. That was when I found her. Victoria Sterling didn't just hold the fake title of Vice President of Marketing. Victoria was the sole registered owner of an entirely separate, obscure, limited liability company called VS Creative Consulting. I pulled the corporate filings for VS Creative Consulting. I traced the registered agent. I traced the associated banking relationships through public vendor payment registries. My father wasn't just defrauding his clients. He was embezzling the company's capital. Sterling and Cross was paying VS Creative Consulting hundreds of thousands of dollars every single month for marketing and brand management services. The money was being funneled straight out of the family business operating accounts, money that belonged to the predatory lenders who held liens on the inventory, and dumped directly into Victoria's personal LLC. That was how she afforded the penthouse. That was how my parents afforded the ski chalet. They were using Victoria's shell company to launder the corporate debt into personal wealth, hiding the assets from their creditors. And because Victoria was the sole owner of the LLC, she was the one holding the bag. She was the one legally committing the tax fraud, the wire fraud, and the embezzlement. My father had set up his golden favorite child as the ultimate fall guy, completely insulating himself from the criminal liability of the stolen funds. He had asked for my social security number because he had wanted to set up a second shell company in my name to spread the risk. When I refused, he just dumped it all on Victoria. And Victoria, who was too arrogant and too stupid to read the documents she signed, had gleefully taken the money, entirely unaware that she had signed a confession to a federal crime. I sat back in my desk chair, staring at the intricate, damning flowchart I had built across my 3 monitors. They had laughed at my daughter. They had handed an 8-year-old an empty box to prove they were untouchable gods of luxury. I picked up the printed stack of UCC filings, the shipping manifests, and the corporate registry for VS Creative Consulting. I placed them neatly into a sleek, black leather portfolio. It was time to show my family what an empty box really looked like. There is a very specific clinical kind of patience required to dismantle a corporate fraud. You cannot rush it. You cannot let your emotions dictate your timeline. When you are holding the exact documents that will detonate a person's entire life, the most dangerous thing you can do is show your hand too early. For 3 months following that Christmas Eve, I did not speak a single word to my family. I blocked my parents' phone numbers. I blocked Victoria on every social media platform. I didn't send a text. I didn't write an email. And I certainly didn't demand an apology for the empty cardboard box they had handed my daughter. I knew exactly how they would interpret my silence. In their narcissistic, reality-warping minds, they assumed I was sulking. They assumed I was sitting in my modest suburban house, drowning in jealousy over their imported cars and diamond bracelets, too ashamed of my own worthless life to face them. My mother actually left a voicemail on my work phone in late January, proving my exact theory. "Vivian, really, this silent treatment is incredibly immature." Eleanor sighed into the receiver, her voice dripping with aristocratic condescension. "You completely overreacted to a simple family joke. Maya needs to understand that the real world doesn't hand out participation trophies. Your father is closing a massive multi-million-dollar hotel contract this spring, and we are hosting a major partnership gala. If you want to be included in the family's success, you need to apologize and stop acting like such a victim. We will leave a ticket at the door for you." I saved the voicemail to my encrypted drive. I didn't call her back. I didn't need to, because I already knew everything there was to know about the massive hotel contract my father was closing. In fact, I knew more about it than he did. The contract was with the Vanguard Hospitality Group, a massive, publicly traded luxury hotel conglomerate. Vanguard was launching a new tier of ultra-exclusive boutique hotels across the country, and they needed a bespoke furniture supplier to stage the lobbies and penthouse suites. My father had spent the last year aggressively wooing the Vanguard executives, promising them handcrafted, imported European furnishings at an incredibly competitive wholesale rate. It was a $20 million contract. If Richard Sterling secured that deal, the advance payment alone would be enough to pay off his predatory, high-interest mezzanine loans, effectively bailing out his entire fraudulent operation. It was his golden parachute. But Vanguard Hospitality was a publicly traded company, and publicly traded companies have incredibly strict risk tolerance thresholds. Before they sign a $20 million vendor agreement, their board of directors requires a comprehensive, third-party forensic audit of the vendor's supply chain and financial health, and the firm Vanguard Hospitality retained to conduct their global corporate audits was my firm, Apex Risk Management. I didn't have to hack into a system or steal a file to get the Sterling and Cross account. When the audit request came across the desk of my managing partner in February, I simply walked into his office, closed the door, and invoked a professional conflict of interest clause. I disclosed that Richard Sterling was my father. My managing partner immediately moved to reassign the file to another team to maintain objectivity. "I'm not asking to be removed from the account, David," I told my managing partner calmly. "I am disclosing the relation so I can formally request to be the lead auditor. I suspect severe systemic supply chain fraud and illegal commingling of corporate assets. If Vanguard signs this contract, they will be stepping into a massive federal liability trap. I know where the bodies are buried. Let me pull the ledgers." David looked at me for a long time. He knew my track record. He knew I didn't make accusations without the data to back them up. He handed me the file. For the next 8 weeks, I operated as the invisible ghost haunting my father's empire. Because Vanguard had required Sterling and Cross to open their books as a condition of the contract, my team had full, unrestricted access to their corporate data room. We pulled their tax returns, their banking statements, their payroll ledgers, and their international shipping manifests. My father thought he was dealing with faceless corporate accountants in a skyscraper 3 states away. He had absolutely no idea that his worthless, boring daughter was the one meticulously tracing every single fraudulent wire transfer he had ever authorized. What I found was even worse than I had initially hypothesized in December. The furniture wasn't just mass-produced in unregulated overseas factories. The materials were actively dangerous. The supposed Italian leather sofas were constructed using highly toxic, non-compliant synthetic dyes. The solid oak bed frames were cheap MDF board held together by formaldehyde-heavy adhesives. If Vanguard placed this furniture in their luxury hotels, they wouldn't just be overpaying. They would be exposing themselves to catastrophic multi-million-dollar health and safety lawsuits from their own guests. And the embezzlement? It was staggering. The shell company, VS Creative Consulting, wasn't just laundering a few $1,000s a month for Victoria's rent. Over the last 2 years, Richard had funneled nearly $4 million out of his business operating accounts and directly into Victoria's LLC under the guise of brand expansion consulting. Victoria had used the money to fund the ski chalet, the Porsche, the diamond bracelets, and my mother's country club lifestyle. Victoria was the sole signatory on the LLC. The moment the IRS or the commercial lenders looked at the books, my father would claim ignorance, and my 29-year-old sister would be indicted for felony tax evasion, wire fraud, and grand larceny. I compiled the final 400-page forensic audit. I summarized the findings into a razor-sharp, devastating 10-page executive report. I submitted it directly to the CEO and the board of directors at Vanguard Hospitality. The Vanguard executives were horrified. They immediately moved to terminate all negotiations with Sterling and Cross, but I asked them for one highly irregular favor. Do not cancel the contract over email, I advised the CEO during a secure Zoom call. Richard Sterling is a desperate man holding millions of dollars in predatory debt. If you cancel quietly, he will panic, liquidate whatever assets he has left, and attempt to flee his creditors, leaving his employees and secondary vendors holding the bag. You need to confront him with the audit in person, so he is forced to acknowledge the breach on the record. The CEO agreed. They would proceed with the scheduled partnership unveiling gala my parents were hosting in April. But they wouldn't be arriving to sign a contract. They would be arriving to serve a formal termination notice and a demand for the immediate return of their preliminary earnest money. Which brings us to the evening of the gala. The event was held at the most exclusive, astronomically expensive country club in the county. My parents had spared absolutely no expense. There were towering ice sculptures carved with the Sterling and Cross logo. A string quartet played in the corner. The ballroom was packed with local politicians, wealthy investors, and the entire roster of my mother's elite social circle. It was designed to be the ultimate coronation of the Sterling family empire. I did not wear a modest suburban dress. I wore a tailored, razor-sharp charcoal executive suit. I pulled my hair back into a severe professional knot. I carried the sleek black leather portfolio that contained the Vanguard audit, the shipping manifests, and the corporate registry for VS Creative Consulting. I didn't look like the family disappointment. I looked like a woman who was about to repossess the building. When I walked through the heavy mahogany doors of the ballroom, the string quartet was playing Vivaldi. I scanned the room and spotted my family standing near the front of the room by a massive display table, surrounded by a group of Vanguard executives who had just arrived. My mother, Eleanor, was wearing a shimmering gold gown that probably cost a quarter of my annual salary. Victoria was draped in silk, holding a champagne flute, laughing loudly at a joke one of the local investors had just made. My father was holding court, gesturing grandly toward a massive leather-bound contract sitting on the display table. Eleanor saw me first. Her laughter stopped abruptly. Her eyes widened, scanning my severe suit, my lack of makeup, and the complete absence of subservience in my posture. She nudged my father, who turned to look at me. Richard's face contorted into a mask of furious, embarrassed irritation. He excused himself from the Vanguard executives and marched across the ballroom floor toward me, grabbing my elbow and attempting to steer me toward the exit. "What are you doing here, Vivian?" my father hissed, his voice a low, threatening whisper. "I explicitly told your mother not to leave a ticket for you. You are not ruining this night for me. Do you have any idea who is in this room? The Vanguard executives are about to sign a $20 million deal. Get out." "I know exactly who is in this room, Richard," I said, my voice completely level. I didn't pull my arm away. I just looked down at his hand until he felt the cold, unnatural stillness radiating off of me, and slowly let go. "Then you know you don't belong here," Eleanor spat, materializing at my father's side. She looked me up and down with absolute disgust. "You look like a tax collector. Go home, Vivian. You can send Maya a postcard from the new ski house." "I think I'll stay," I said smoothly. "In fact, I have an appointment with the Vanguard CEO right now." I stepped around my parents, leaving them staring at my back in absolute furious confusion, and walked directly toward the display table where the Vanguard executives were gathered. Victoria, who was standing near the contract, saw me approaching and rolled her eyes dramatically. "Oh, great. The fun police have arrived. Are you here to audit the champagne, Viv?" I ignored her. I walked straight up to Marcus Thorne, the CEO of Vanguard Hospitality. Marcus was a tall, imposing man with silver hair and the kind of quiet authority that my father spent his entire life trying to fake. Marcus looked at me, recognized me from our Zoom calls, and offered a firm, respectful nod. "Ms. Sterling," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly over the ambient noise of the ballroom. "I'm glad you could make it in person. The board and I have reviewed your firm's executive summary. To say we are disturbed would be a massive understatement." My father, who had rushed back over to intercept me, froze dead in his tracks. "Marcus, I apologize," Richard stammered, his confident, booming voice suddenly fracturing. He looked frantically between me and the CEO. "I don't know why my daughter is bothering you. Vivian doesn't work for Sterling and Cross. She's an accountant." "I am aware of what your daughter does, Richard," Marcus said, his tone dropping 20 degrees into absolute, freezing corporate disdain. "She is the lead forensic auditor for Apex Risk Management, the firm Vanguard hired to audit your supply chain." The blood drained out of my father's face so fast he looked as though he were about to physically collapse. The golden spray tan suddenly looked like dirt over pale ash. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a terror I had never, ever seen him display. Eleanor, completely failing to grasp the gravity of the situation, let out a sharp, dismissive laugh. "Oh, please. Vivian is a low-level desk clerk. If you wanted a real audit, Marcus, you should have hired a real firm. She's just trying to cause drama because she's jealous of her sister." Before you hear the exact moment I emptied the box in front of the entire ballroom, if you have ever been the quiet one in your family who finally brought the receipts, hit the subscribe button. Because the documents in my portfolio are about to tear this fake empire down to the studs, I unzipped the black leather portfolio. I didn't look at my mother. I didn't look at Victoria. I looked directly at the man who had mocked my career for 15 years. "I'm not jealous, Dad," I said, pulling out the first stack of documents. "I'm just thorough." I placed the shipping manifests face up on the display table, right next to the massive, unsigned Vanguard contract. "These are the international bills of lading for your last 18 months of inventory, Richard," I said, projecting my voice so the local investors standing nearby could hear every single word. "You promised Vanguard bespoke, handcrafted Italian and French furniture, but according to customs declarations, you haven't imported a single container from Europe in 2 years. You are importing mass-produced, chemically non-compliant MDF furniture from unregulated factories overseas, shipping them to a warehouse in Nevada, and swapping the tags." A collective horrified gasp rippled through the Vanguard executive team. One of the local investors, a man who had personally lent my father $1 million the previous year, stepped forward, his face turning red. "Richard, is this true?" the investor demanded. "It's a lie," my father shouted, his voice cracking violently. He slammed his hand down on the table, trying to cover the manifests. She forged these. She hacked my system. Marcus, listen to me. My daughter is mentally unstable. I didn't forge federal customs documents, Dad, I replied calmly, sliding the papers out from under his shaking hand. And I certainly didn't forge the toxicology reports. The leather dyes you use are highly toxic. If Vanguard placed your furniture in their hotels, they would be facing a class action health hazard lawsuit within 6 months. You aren't a luxury importer. You are running a dangerous, illegal counterfeiting ring. Eleanor grabbed my arm, her manicured claws digging into my suit jacket. Shut up right now, Vivian. You are ruining this deal. You are ruining our lives over a stupid cardboard box. I looked down at her hand. I looked into her furious, panicked eyes. The empty box was just the catalyst, Mom, I said softly. The ruin was entirely self-inflicted. I pulled out the second stack of documents. These were the UCC filings and the commercial loan agreements. You don't just have a supply chain problem, Richard, I continued, turning my attention back to the crowd. You have a massive, unmitigated debt crisis. You took out $7 million in predatory mezzanine loans to fund this lavish lifestyle, using inventory you don't actually own as collateral. That's confidential corporate information, my father screamed, practically frothing at the mouth, completely losing control in front of the very people he needed to impress. It's public record, if you know how to read a ledger, I corrected him. Victoria, who had been standing in shocked silence, suddenly crossed her arms, trying to project the haughty, untouchable arrogance she had relied on her entire life. You know what, Vivian? You're just a bitter, broke, single mother who can't stand that Dad made me vice president instead of you. Who cares if the furniture is imported from somewhere else? We make money. I make money. You're just mad you don't have a Porsche. I paused. I looked at my younger sister. I looked at the diamond bracelets sparkling on her wrists. I don't want your Porsche, Victoria, I said, my voice dropping into a deadly quiet cadence. Because your Porsche was bought with stolen money, I reached into the portfolio for the final, most devastating document, the corporate registry for VS Creative Consulting. What are you talking about? Victoria scoffed, though a flicker of genuine uncertainty finally crossed her eyes. I laid the registry documents on the table, right next to a printed ledger of wire transfers. This is the corporate filing for VS Creative Consulting, I announced to the room. An LLC registered exclusively in your name, Victoria. Over the last 2 years, Dad has funneled nearly $4 million out of Sterling and Cross operating accounts, money that legally belongs to his commercial lenders, and wired it directly into your shell company under the guise of fake marketing expenses. Victoria stared at the paper. The color began to drain from her face as she saw her own signature at the bottom of the LLC formation document. Dad said he was just setting up a tax-advantaged payroll account for me. He told me to sign it to get my bonus. He lied to you, I told her, feeling absolutely zero pity. He used your name to launder the corporate debt into personal wealth. He embezzled millions of dollars to pay for Mom's ski chalet and your luxury penthouse, and he made you the sole legal signatory. I looked my sister dead in the eyes. You aren't a vice president, Victoria, I said, the words falling like anvil strikes in the dead silent ballroom. You are a money mule. And when the IRS and the commercial lenders audit this company tomorrow morning, Dad is going to claim ignorance, and you are going to be indicted for felony tax evasion and grand larceny. The silence inside that ballroom didn't just drop, it plummeted. It was the sound of a $20 million illusion hitting a concrete floor and shattering into a million irreparable pieces. Victoria stared at the corporate registry sitting on the display table. Her eyes darted from her own signature on the LLC formation document to the printed ledger of $4 million in illicit wire transfers. The haughty, arrogant smirk she had worn for 29 years melted off her face, replaced by a sudden, visceral, suffocating terror. Dad, Victoria whispered, her voice trembling so violently she could barely form the word. She looked at our father, stepping away from him as if he were carrying a plague. Dad, what is she talking about? You said the LLC was just a tax write-off. You told me it was a standard executive bonus structure. Richard Sterling, the man who had spent his entire life projecting absolute authority, completely unraveled. He looked at Marcus Thorne, the CEO of Vanguard Hospitality. He looked at the furious local investors closing in around the table. And finally, he looked at his golden child. "Don't be dramatic, Victoria," Richard snapped, his voice a frantic, desperate bark. He tried to grab the documents off the table, but Marcus Thorne calmly placed his hand over the papers, pinning them to the wood. "It's a misunderstanding. It's creative accounting. Every major corporation does it. Creative accounting doesn't involve laundering secured commercial debt through your daughter's name to buy ski chalets, Richard," Marcus Thorne said. His voice was freezing cold, dripping with the absolute disdain of a man who realized he had almost signed a contract with a criminal. Marcus picked up the massive, leather-bound Vanguard contract from the table. He didn't tear it up. He just handed it to one of his executives. "The Vanguard Hospitality Group is formally withdrawing from all negotiations, effective immediately," Marcus announced, his voice carrying to the back of the silent room. "Furthermore, our legal department will be filing an injunction tomorrow morning to recover our preliminary earnest money. If those funds are not in our accounts by 9 a.m. on Monday, we will be contacting the federal authorities." "Marcus, please, you can't do this," Eleanor shrieked, lunging forward, completely abandoning any pretense of aristocratic grace. She grabbed Marcus's sleeve. "We've already spent the earnest money. We booked the factories. You have to sign." Marcus looked down at my mother's hand until she slowly, humiliatingly let go. "You didn't book any factories, Eleanor," Marcus said, adjusting his suit jacket. "You bought a lie, and we don't do business with liars." Marcus turned to me. He offered a brief, respectful nod, an acknowledgement between two professionals who dealt in fact, not illusions. "Thank you for your exceptional diligence, Ms. Sterling. Your firm will be highly recommended by our board." With that, Marcus Thorne and the Vanguard executive team turned around and walked out of the ballroom. They took the $20 million golden parachute with them. The moment the heavy mahogany doors swung shut behind the Vanguard executives, the true chaos began. The local investor, the man who had personally lent my father $1 million, stepped right up to Richard, his face purple with rage. "You used my money to buy a penthouse," the investor roared, grabbing my father by the lapels of his expensive tuxedo. "You told me my capital was securing European supply lines. I want my money back, Richard. Every single dime." "Get your hands off him," Eleanor screamed, trying to pull the investor away. Victoria, meanwhile, had completely mentally collapsed. The reality of her legal exposure had finally crashed down on her. She realized she wasn't a vice president. She wasn't a business genius. She was the fall guy for a multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme, and the paper trail led directly to her front door. "You set me up!" Victoria shrieked at our father, tears of pure panic ruining her expensive makeup. She pointed a shaking finger at Richard, her voice echoing over the frantic whispers of the wealthy guests who were practically running for the exits to avoid the fallout. "You put my name on the LLC. You knew the lenders would come after me. I am not going to federal prison for you." "Shut up, Victoria," Richard bellowed, his face red and sweating, pushing the investor away. "You spent the money. You drove the Porsche. You didn't complain when you were cashing the checks, did you?" "I didn't know the money was stolen," Victoria sobbed, retreating into a corner of the ballroom. "I'm calling a lawyer. I'm telling them everything. I'll tell them you made me sign it." I stood a few feet away, watching my family completely tear each other to shreds. There was no loyalty. There was no sterling empire. The second the money evaporated, the aristocratic facade burned to the ground, leaving behind three terrified, selfish people who were perfectly willing to throw each other to the wolves to save themselves. I looked down at the display table. The shipping manifests, the loan documents, and the LLC registry were still sitting there. I didn't pack them back into my portfolio. I didn't need them anymore. They belonged to the public record now. I picked up my sleek black leather portfolio. I zipped it shut. It was completely empty. I walked over to my mother, who was currently hyperventilating near the ice sculpture, watching her entire social circle flee the room in horror. "Mom," I said quietly, cutting through her panic. Eleanor snapped her head toward me, her eyes wild with a hatred so deep it was almost fascinating to witness. "You," she spat, her voice a venomous hiss. "You did this. You destroyed your own family." "I didn't destroy anything. I replied, my voice perfectly calm. I held up the empty black leather portfolio. I just brought you an empty box. It builds character to realize you don't just get things handed to you in this life. I didn't wait for her to scream again. I turned my back on the weeping vice president, the bankrupt CEO, and the hysterical chief creative officer. I walked across the marble floor, the sharp click of my heels the only sound I cared to listen to, and I walked out the front doors of the country club. The night air was crisp and cool. I got into my sensible, reliable sedan, started the engine, and drove home to my daughter. The aftermath. If you think the public humiliation at the gala was the end of the Sterling and Cross empire, you drastically underestimate how fast commercial lenders move when they realize their collateral is fake. By Tuesday morning, the fallout was apocalyptic. The local investors who had attended the gala immediately filed emergency injunctions to freeze Sterling and Cross's operating accounts. The high-interest mezzanine lenders, terrified of losing their capital, executed their UCC liens. They sent a fleet of commercial trucks to my father's warehouse in Nevada to seize the inventory. When the lenders opened the shipping containers and found toxic mass-produced MDF furniture instead of bespoke European imports, they didn't just sue, they contacted the FBI. Sterling and Cross was forced into involuntary Chapter 7 bankruptcy within a month. But a bankruptcy doesn't protect you from criminal liability when you've been cooking the books. The IRS and federal investigators raided the company headquarters. They found exactly what my forensic audit had already proven: massive wire fraud, tax evasion, and a multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme routed through VS Creative Consulting. Victoria, terrified of serving hard time in federal prison, did exactly what I knew she would do. She flipped on her own father. She hired a defense attorney and cut a deal with the prosecutors. In exchange for immunity from the most severe wire fraud charges, Victoria handed over every single email, text message, and internal memo, proving that Richard Sterling had explicitly directed the transfer of illicit funds into her shell company. She testified that her father had manipulated her into signing the LLC documents and had complete control over the banking tokens. Richard Sterling was indicted on multiple counts of federal wire fraud, bank fraud, and tax evasion. Because he had personally guaranteed the predatory loans, the bankruptcy court pierced his corporate veil. They took everything. The court seized the sprawling suburban estate where my mother had handed Maya the empty box. They seized the ski chalet. They repossessed Victoria's Porsche and auctioned off my mother's diamond tennis bracelets to pay back a fraction of what they owed to their creditors. Eleanor lost her country club membership. She lost her social standing. The elite friends she had spent 30 years trying to impress wouldn't even return her phone calls. In their world, financial ruin is a contagious disease, and Eleanor Sterling was patient zero. Today, my parents live in a cramped two-bedroom apartment in a distinctly unglamorous zip code. From what I hear through the grapevine, Eleanor tries to tell the neighbors they are downsizing to embrace a minimalist lifestyle, but nobody believes her. Richard is currently awaiting trial, facing up to a decade in federal prison. Victoria moved out of state. Without her fake corporate title and her laundered money, her influencer aesthetic collapsed. She works as a shift manager at a high-end retail clothing store now, folding the exact same designer brands she used to brag about buying. They do not speak to each other. The family that worshipped money completely disintegrated the second the money ran out. And me? I didn't gloat. I didn't send them a postcard. I simply went back to my life. My firm, Apex Risk Management, was flooded with new corporate clients who had read about the Vanguard audit. I was promoted to managing partner of the forensic division. I received a massive equity stake in the firm. Maya is 10 years old now. She is brilliant, kind, and thriving. We live in the same modest, comfortable 3-bedroom house because a house is just a place to sleep. Peace is what actually makes it a home. Last Christmas, we didn't have a 12-foot tree decorated in cold silver and frost. We had a real pine tree, decorated with messy, handmade ornaments Maya and I painted ourselves. There were no imported sports cars in the driveway. There were no caterers. It was just the two of us, drinking hot cocoa in our pajamas. When Maya opened her presents, there were no empty boxes. There were books, art supplies, and a telescope she had been begging for. She looked up at me, her eyes bright and happy, entirely untouched by the toxic, status-obsessed poison of the Sterling family. My mother had told Maya that kids like her shouldn't expect luxury. My mother was wrong. True luxury isn't a diamond bracelet bought with stolen money, or a leased Porsche parked outside a penthouse you don't actually own. True luxury is the ability to sleep at night, knowing that every single thing you have, you earned. True luxury is knowing that no one can ever audit your life and find a lie. I was 34 years old, the evening my family tried to use my daughter as a prop to make themselves feel powerful. I was 34 and a half when I legally, surgically, and quietly dismantled their entire empire using the exact skills they had spent 15 years mocking. That is my story. One empty box, one 400-page forensic audit, and a ballroom full of elite socialites who finally learned what a real risk assessment looks like. If you are currently the scapegoat in a family that values appearances over reality, take this as your sign to stop trying to prove your worth to them. You don't need to shout to be heard. You don't need to buy flashy things to be valuable. Just do your work. Keep your side of the street clean. And wait. Because people who build their lives on illusions will always, eventually, hand you the paperwork that proves it. Thank you so much for joining me today on Whispered Drama Stories. If you loved watching the Sterling family's house of cards collapse under the weight of a real audit, drop a comment below and let me know your favorite moment from the Vanguard Gala. Please hit the like button. Share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that the quiet ones always keep the receipts, and make sure you are subscribed so you never miss a story.